Hello and welcome to today's CDCT live session. I'm your host, Jason Rader with Insight's Cloud and Data Center Transformation Division. Today we're talking about modernization via automation. Well, at least we're starting there. Where we go, who knows? With me today on this roller coaster of a topic are two bona fide experts. We've got Juan Orlandini, our chief architect, and Jeff Bozic, one of our principal architects here at Insight CDCT. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for joining me today.
Hey, Jason. Good to be here.
So, you know, I've already introduced you as experts, so we've got that out of the way.
Thanks for setting the bar really high.
But, you know, the general consensus is if you're an expert at something, you can explain it relatively easily in simple terms. So for those folks, you know, we kind of run this show as kind of a drive-by where folks who are kind of see it online and want to check it out, they can, you know, take a look at it. It doesn't have to get too heavy or have too much background information before they get involved. So let's start off with kind of the simple description of automation in general, or what, at least in the context of what we're talking about today. Who wants to tackle that?
I'll take the first stab at it, and then I'm sure Jeff will jump in. So automation can be lots of different things, but in the context of IT is, in essence, making repeatable tasks redoable, right? And the value in that is that if there is a task that you do very frequently or very often, it can be redone in a consistent way from time to time to time to time. That's the simplest definition that I know in order to put it. Would you add anything to that, Jeff?
I mean, the only thing I'd add is around consistency as well. So if you want to make sure that every deployment looks the same, acts the same, feels the same, that can also be achieved with automation as well. Kind of that high level of why would you do it? You know, speed and consistency.
And I love that angle because that kind of goes more into the context of why we're talking about it today, right? So that how you achieve this modernization, in air quotes, via automation. So let's throw that one out there. Boom. What do you think where do you think most people are when they're thinking about this topic organizationally right now?
Well, they're all over the place. It's a little bit all over the place. So I think maybe a better approach at this is where they should be headed towards, right? And then you can gauge whether or not you've gotten there or not. Yeah. And I'll tell you, there's a very famous author out there, Gene Kim. He's written several DevOps books that are fantastic reads. And one of his mottos is, and it's not just his, it's just kind of a part of the industry, is that you should get automation to the point where it's cheaper to rebuild than it is to fix, right? And what that's really talking about is that, and there's a lot of connotations with that, because your application needs to be built that way, your infrastructure has to be set up so that you can do all of those things. But the end goal being is that, hey, you're in the midst of a war and you're trying to figure out, and this is an IT war, right? Sure. You're trying to rebuild, you're trying to figure out what's broken and what's not broken. You identify what's broken, rebuild it, and figure out why it broke down the road. And your mean time to recovery goes down, your application availability goes up, and things are much better that way. And then you still have to do the the after action review to figure out why it happened, the observability to figure out why or what you need to put in place so that it doesn't happen again. But in the meantime, fix it, get it done, move on. Right.
Understood. So you're talking about the, oh, sorry.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, Jason. Go ahead on the thread.
I was going to say on that rebuild angle, you kind of mean reinstantiate the workload or whatever we happen to be automating. Is that correct?
Or the portion of the workload or whatever that's broken. That's exactly right. So your simplest way to put it is imagine an e-commerce website. All of a sudden your website is down and you got to bring it back up. And one way to do it is to go and start troubleshooting what broke and typing away like mad and going and figuring all these things. The other one is say, I don't care, I need to get it back up. Hit a button, automation brings everything back up to a known good state. And then afterwards you go and figure out what happened, right? And part of the infrastructure as code, the DevOps, and there's a whole thing that ties into that. But that's ultimately where you want to get to, right? And that's a simplistic example, but I mean, it can be a microservice, it could be a whole app, it could be a whole data center. the automation that you want to get to it can vary quite a bit.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, actually, Jason, because the word automation to me, to Juan's point, it means a lot of things and it covers a lot of ground. One of the things that I think is kind of interesting about the way people talk about it today is we've been automating forever. I mean, every admin I've known that's worth their paycheck scripts has been writing scripts all their life to automate the mundane tasks of their job, so they can focus on things that are more fun for them and innovative. So I think as we start to look at it in today's times, one has used the word DevOps. I think that drives a lot of what people mean when they say automation, or why it's becoming a little bit more of a buzzword today. But it definitely does depend on really who you're talking to. Because I think generally today, when people talk about automation, it's around how can I automate the delivery of some sort or deployment of some sort of an application.
Right.
And so depending on what group you're talking about, they might only be focused on their little purview of the area. So cloud and data center transformation, a lot of times we're talking to infrastructure teams. So they're focused on how can I deploy infrastructure and how can I do that, again, faster and more consistent. If you're talking to an application team, it might be how can I test my code in an automated fashion, so that as soon as I'm done writing it, I can have it tested and hardened so that it can be checked in as a sanctioned artifact or something along those lines. So it really kind of depends, where you're talking. Everyone's trying to automate to again, reduce their toil and their mundane tasks so they can focus on things that are a little bit higher value. But really in IT, I think a lot of it's kind of focused around that provisioning of infrastructure, and whether that's for themselves as an IT team or as part of some sort of, an application, fully automated pipeline, as Juan was talking about with DevOps. I think that's really where a lot of the context is today as we talk with customers about it.
So, hey, Jeff, you used a word that I think it's really important that we get clear what it means, toil. Would you mind defining that one so that the audience really understands what we mean when we say that?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's work done that is working around an inefficient process. So a lot of people hear the word technical debt. They're not synonyms, but they certainly are siblings of words in terms of, technical debt is knowingly taking on debt to make progress towards something. Toil is when you're not making progress towards something. So how can I, instead of just doing the same thing over and over again, where I'm spending a lot of effort and I'm not really getting any additional value out of it, I can reduce that value by automating some of those tasks so I can get that time back and actually put it towards something of value.
That's great. I think that's something we've got to make more mainstream, because I really love that conversation, because that's a whole different angle that organizations should be taking from a morale perspective and an efficiency perspective, right?
Yeah.
And you said something really interesting, Jeff, that I hadn't thought about. So if I'm worth my paycheck and I've done a lot of automation-based things that have helped me instantiate infrastructure, and then this conversation related to DevOps, to Juan's point, comes out, and these guys are talking automation, and they're asking us if we're ready to do some automation. It doesn't sound like we're talking about the same thing, and we can run into a significant culture clash within an organization.
Well, Juan called it out earlier about what the value is of what you're automating. Oddly enough, I've written countless scripts in my life to automate mundane tasks, as I've been an admin and engineer in my life. And one thing I've never actually written a script to automate was the provisioning of infrastructure. A lot of the ways that we had set things up just didn't lend itself to that being a task that made a lot of sense. And it's pretty complex to automate that piece of it. So going back to Juan's point, was the effort worth, the reward? So most of the times, it was these small little things, go restart this service, go run this script, go email this report, maybe go run through this list of things to extract, some piece of value. So ultimately, when it comes down to truly automating infrastructure, I think that has been a relatively new thing in the last probably 10 years-ish or so. You saw tools like vRealize Automator and UCSD from Cisco come out a while back to help infrastructure teams. That's kind of the start of when I started to have a lot of conversations with clients about what does automation really mean. And again, a lot of it comes down to Juan's point is what is the value of what you're automating? And is it worth the effort? Because automation is not a simple task. And, it's something I think we'll probably talk a little bit more about today. But it takes some discipline, and it takes some hard work to get to automating safely, or it is actually doing good things for you, and you're automating good things, or you're doing good things faster and not automating bad things and just proliferating bad things faster.
So, Jeff, on that point, I in fact have automated infrastructure and help clients use vRealize automation and many of the other tools that are out there to provision VMs faster, or provision what we call apps faster. But it really was maybe a lamp stack or something along those lines, right? And then we built these highly automated private clouds. And I'm using air quotes again. And then we turned it over to our consumers inside of IT, and we called it job well done. And then we saw zero consumption of that stuff. And it turned out that we had automated was the wrong thing. And so it's really, really important that you don't high five yourself because you automated some tasks that you do, which has some value, but you automate something that's got value to the organization. All right. And that's the thing that I did wrong along with my clients, because they thought I was very successful in what I automated for them, right? And what we saw was that developers would look at this stuff and click on a button, and maybe they got their VM or lamp stack or whatever it was that they were getting. And then they would go run off and spend 6 weeks building the rest of the tooling that's necessary for them to actually do their development work, right? And we hadn't really finished the job. And we needed to go and have this deeper look at what it meant to do automation, to really get it to the to use a football analogy, the 5-yard line, when the devs can pick it up from the 5-yard line and take it to the goal, right? And it's the kind of value that we need to accelerate. It's not the task itself, right? And time to value.
Another example of that one actually was client wanted to automate. I forget what tool it was, but one of those tools, is about 5 years ago, automating VM provisioning. And so we went in there and we helped them figure out, what the right tool was based on the equipment they had and the people they had. They got some pretty cool workflows down with a pretty cool catalog, and it's very similar to what you just described. You'd click and get a VM pretty quickly, and it was in the right place. Yeah, they'd have to go do some patching and things of that nature. But the irony was why it wasn't of value was because IT automated the provisioning of what they thought people wanted. And ultimately, the consumers weren't using it because what was in the catalog wasn't what they wanted. And so IT was always trying to catch up because, again, they were building what they thought was the right things and not realizing who their customer was, to your point, of the developers, and saying, hey, what do you guys want? You're the ones that are consuming the infrastructure I'm providing to you. So let me go to my customer and actually figure out what they would want, and then go ahead and automate that on the back end. I oftentimes use the AWS example. AWS or Azure or Google, they don't have engineers back there just surmising in a think tank what they think people will want and go build it. It was always built based on a need that was there that developers couldn't get, and so they built towards a specific ask, a specific need, and everything they build comes from what is being asked for and what is needed, not what they think people want.
Yeah, I think exactly right. And sorry, Jason. And I tell you, you hit on something that's been a personal thing for me recently, is that the developer first approach, which can be instantiated by API first and several other things, is really probably a good starting point for the automation journey. You might end up automating other things beyond that, but maybe starting with your developers inside your organization and making their jobs easier is a good lens through which to look what are the things that IT should be automating. And at the end, you might end up automating the application itself and the provisioning and all those other things, but that will be in partnership with the development organization rather than in oh, by the way, they do this and I do that, right? It'll be a cooperative development cycle.
Man, I'm sorry, Jason. I love that point. And actually, it's something I thought we'd maybe get to later. But one of the things we've been finding in terms of automation, relates to, kind of a DevOps stack that you're talking about, Juan, in that pipeline, is when you're automating for the developer, and especially the infrastructure team trying to automate deployment, whenever we see what we call pairwise programming, or pairing up that infrastructure guy with that developer to actually work together, the magic that can happen there is wonderful, because when you're starting to talk about writing, especially infrastructure as code, and really automating as part of a code pipeline, there's a lot of discipline that comes with that. Your code has to become reusable. We've talked about in the past, it has to become actually treated as part of source code. And a lot of the IT teams don't know some of that discipline, how to comment your code, how to make it reusable, how to make it readable by somebody else that's going to have to come in and either modify it or use it in some other way. So they'll start to learn some of those cool techniques. And infrastructure people have always complained about the fact that, the app teams feel what we do is magic and that it's easy and just should happen. But it's obviously really hard to understand how to manage infrastructure and provision it, and especially to manage it in an efficient way. What is an IOP and how do I actually provide that in an efficient manner, relate cost and availability. And so helping the application developers start to understand some of those nuances helps them consider what the requirements need to be. And working together, you can really get some very cool value. People not only getting to that automation that you really want, but a bunch of other kind of cool ancillary learning and capabilities that come from that.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because there's some Perl and some Python and some shell scripts that I've written that I've gone back to 6 months, a year, many years later, and looked at and go, what the heck was I thinking when I wrote that? Not in a bad way. I just didn't understand what I'd done, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to use that again, but I don't know what I did. And I failed to do the programming 101, comment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the thing that infrastructure people need to go learn from the developers, right?
And I think it's honestly a really critical change, going from what we were talking about earlier of writing some scripts and maintaining your own bash scripts or shell scripts, or whether it's PowerShell or VB or Python or bash or whatever it is. Typically as an admin, I'm writing that script for myself to automate my task, to make my life easier. And so I'm not considering anybody else using this. I don't even, to your point, I never even considered me using it 2 years from now and trying to remember what I wrote. I was just in this mode of, let me just get this done so that, over the next foreseeable future, I don't have to keep doing this thing. That mentality really has to shift. Why would I automate? Those reasons haven't really changed that much, as we've talked about. The tools change a little bit. You're still writing some code to do some things. So that hasn't really changed a whole lot. But just that mindset shift of, this isn't just for me to make my life easier. This is now for my organization to add value to a whole bunch of people and my overall delivery of infrastructure and applications. And so that mindset, I think, is, if there's one point I'd like people to get from this that are in IT, that are, trying to understand what automation is, that would be one of my big points and takeaways is realize that you're not building this for yourself anymore. You're building it for others. And that takes a different mindset shift. And, maybe it does take a little bit of a training class or something to understand, how should I comment my code, or how should I structure it in a way that someone else could read it easier? Could be a useful track.
I think you guys made the exact segue I was looking to make as far as this goes. I think, when we got into this, we immediately came back to that fact that you've got to understand who your internal customers are related to what you're doing. And then to your last point, Jeff, is I think it's more than just a training class. I think it literally is it's a maturity of the way that the culture of the organization is going to have to. I doubt there's any training class that's going to really embed that into that. I mean, and it's kind of where developers were 5-10 years ago, right? As they weren't looking outside the box. They take a requirements document, only do exactly what it said, and okay, great. Whether security was a afterthought or whatever, that's somebody else's problem, because I'm doing exactly what this requirements document says to do. And I think now it's got to be that, collaboration. And I think that whole 1 + 1 = 3 thing is absolutely great with infrastructure and the devs working together. You get way more than you would have got those guys working separate.
You guys are probably familiar with one of our greatest computer scientists ever, Alan Kay. He basically invented GUIs, object-oriented programming, basically everything that we use in our day-to-day lives in our computers. One of his quotes is that the computer should disappear into the environment, right? Mm-hmm. And what he meant by that is that computing is pervasive, right? And the resources that computing makes available to us should not be a goal in and of themselves. They should be part of the background, right? And as IT operations people and that kind of stuff, we should make all the stuff that we manage kind of disappear, right? And to the developer, it's just something that they consume. It's there, it works, it's great, and it's fantastic. And automation is one of the key tools that we have in our bag of tricks to make that happen, right? And that's part of what we really are talking. So these are all aspects of each other that we ultimately really want to get to, where this stuff disappears. My job is to make it look like I'm not doing anything. And in fact, I'm working really hard to make it look like that, right?
I love that. It's like rideshare.
You're too good at that, Juan. You're too good at
it. Yeah, some would say that, right?
What I was going to say is it's like rideshare is done for, renting cars or getting transportation somewhere. I don't even think about that. I just push, enable an app and a means of transport shows up, and then I go there, and I don't really think about how I got there once I get to the location. I think that's where this is evolving to.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I think there's especially as we're talking about application development as part of a pipeline, and if you're an infrastructure team trying to automate, I think there's actually a really interesting, demarcation point there of, is the developer actually triggering your infrastructure as code or whatever the case may be, or are you? And, is there a manual gate there? And how do I expose, if the developer's doing it, how do I expose those APIs? And that opens a totally different can of worms, actually. Developers using APIs to access, whether it's the infrastructure itself, which I would generally not recommend at all, but even to access an infrastructure as code template that it gets deployed, introduces a different part of the process that needs to be focused on as well. There's pieces around how to control APIs that now becomes a contract of who can do what, when, where, why, and how. That has to be managed as well. Versus, if it's you as a infrastructure team, there's a manual gate that says, okay, this request is coming in, go trigger this piece of code. That there's a difference there of to your point, who your audience is. Who are you really building this for? Is it for this fully automated pipeline, which is a very mature thing? In the DevOps world, clients that are either cloud native from the beginning, they're a startup company, or existing companies that are transitioning, becoming cloud native, or their digital transformation journey. Getting to that fully automated pipeline is a multi-year journey, and automating it is one of the last things you do. You build the process, you build all the integration points, you build the whole thing, and then you say, now that we have a working flow, we can start to automate it. So that being said, it doesn't mean that infrastructure teams shouldn't start automating their tasks to make lives easier. Most DevOps pipelines have manual gates, and there's nothing wrong with the infrastructure team saying go, being a manual gate. Even things like verifying there is enough storage to go ahead and provision. Sometimes there's nothing wrong with that. So, getting to this panacea of the developer just checks in code, and the next thing you know, it's deployed on your on-premises, FlexPod or whatever. That is a great dream. It's achievable, but that takes a long time and a lot of maturity to get to that point.
And I think, to your point, should every step of the way be automated? The answer is probably no, right?
No, not until, to Juan's point earlier, that you actually believe there's time savings in doing that, and value in doing that. And that's why part of it, getting the process down, and making sure it's the process that is working for your organization first, makes a lot of sense, because back to what we were talking about earlier, automating a bad process is of negative value, not a positive value. So, if you're really changing a process, or transforming your processes and moving to DevOps, you want to make sure you have those processes correct, or something that works for your organization and is adding value to your organization, and then let's say, okay, the way we can add even more value is by trying to automate this, make it go faster, make it more consistent.
You know, one thing that strikes me about the conversation that we've had, and I want to call it out explicitly, is that we haven't talked about where you automate and what you automate with. All right. Because everything that we've just talked about applies whether you're doing this all on a public cloud and a multi-cloud, a hybrid cloud, or even just on premises. All of these concepts are exactly the same. All right. And we haven't talked about whether we use this tool or that tool. We used examples of where we've done it in the past. And there is absolutely technical value in evaluating the right tools and making sure that they're a cultural fit, a technical fit, an operational fit, all those other things. And there's lots of things that go into that. It's why we have all those tools in our labs, so we can evaluate that ourselves, right? But I just want to call out that automation is really a concept that gets instantiated by these tools. It's not something that the tool enables. So if you have somebody coming in and say, I have this automation tool, it's going to fix all your problems, that's the wrong way to think about it, right? That is absolutely the wrong way to think about it. You got to make sure that you're thinking about it right and then using the tool to fix that problem, right?
It's a really good point, man.
Yeah.
No, and I think that, wrapping the culture around the process versus the process around the culture is one of those things that, again, doesn't matter what the technology is, but you don't want to build it and they will come. You want to understand the way, to everybody's point here, and the lessons learned, right? We want to build the right thing, and then we want to make it as efficient as possible, based on the culture, based on how we don't want to force these folks to work together, but we want to make it so that everything plugs in. And I think they'll realize the benefit of doing that.
Yeah,
that's exactly right.
I think too, and I've talked to a few developers. I've seen cross-functional teams work in organizations. Shadow IT existed ultimately because developers weren't getting what they needed from IT. They weren't moving fast enough and they couldn't provide the right resources. Again, AWS saw that need and built towards that. And I think in a lot of ways, developers lost a lot of trust and faith in IT. And I've seen it. I've seen the real effect of, when that infrastructure guy is reaching out and saying, hey, I want to help you. I want my infrastructure to provide to you what you need. Help me, learn what you need and program some of these things. And again, that the learning goes both ways. I generally see a more friendly approach. I mean, it really does start to break down some of these silos that have been created and have existed for a while. And that's part of that culture that you're talking about, is breaking down some of those silos and some of those biases. So to your point, I mean, it becomes so critical to really get to that point where automation is actually adding value. And the build and they will come. Again, that was the example we used earlier, where not necessarily, and you could waste a lot of time and a lot of effort, money for nothing.
So awesome conversation. I think what we like to leave folks with is kind of, if we're talking about, I love the whole why should we automate question that folks ask, right? Or that we're telling folks that they need to ask themselves. And to deal with the toil, I love that as kind of a polarizing thing. That's maybe that's the low hanging fruit, is the toil. I think in a lot of organizations, but what do you guys think? What's the advice that you would give to folks who need to they recognize all of the things that we said are at the end of a maturity curve for them, and they're at the beginning of this thing? What kind of advice would we give? I mean, and I'm not looking for use Python for everything. I'm looking for, maybe it's this philosophical approach that we're talking about.
Yeah, I can start, and then Juan, I'd love for you to round it out. So the way that I see it is, as we were talking about earlier, automation has always been happening, and it happens along the entire pipeline, or whatever you want to call it, the entire end-to-end operating environment of IT and app development. So to me, when we talk about the maturity, that is having where the entire end-to-end pipeline is fully automated. And that does take a lot of maturity to get there. But, maturity is a journey. You don't just all of a sudden in 5 years say, all right, we're going to start fully automating and my team's going to have this done tomorrow. It takes time, and it does take some of the culture change that you're talking about, and that takes time. So I do think that there is value, there can be value in automating today. So I guess my first piece of advice is, and we've talked about this countless times, is, evaluate whether there's actually a need. Are there tasks that you're doing multiple times? You're doing the same thing regularly. It takes a long time, and we can actually find some value in the amount of time it's going to take to automate this versus what we're going to save, as well as the reducing the risk. Getting back to that consistency perspective, Jez Humboldt has a quote. He's one of the kind of fathers of DevOps, if you will. That oddly enough, DevOps and moving faster helps you become more secure. And there's an interesting kind of dichotomy about that as you think about it. But ultimately, the point is, if you're automating things, you're generally breaking them down into smaller chunks. You can find issues faster, and you can start to automate your security tests and things of that nature. But so, evaluate whether it actually makes sense. Don't do it just because it's a buzzword or it's, the newfangled thing that everyone's talking about. But more than likely, there will be some areas that you can find some value. And I guess my point to infrastructure teams would be, start with focusing on automating your tasks. Start with taking your scripts that you used to do and transform those into something that resembles infrastructure as code. And to me, again, that's not just about a tool. It's more about that mindset of, how do I start to write these things in a way that's sustainable? Work with your team, give it to your team and say, hey, can you manage this? Could you run this? Write your scripts, write your infrastructure as code for other teammates. Little things that you can start to really understand. How do I actually talk to APIs in the background, first of all? Because most of it is talking to APIs of your storage arrays and your data protection arrays and your network devices and your compute devices. That's how most infrastructure as code works. So you start to get familiar with that, start getting familiar with how these code structures, these tools work. And then you start to understand these concepts that will need to be applied as you start to then graduate and your journey get to automating that pipeline. So I think ultimately, if you kind of understand, how powerful it is, but how risky it is to just start jumping into it without a lot of preparation and thought up front, could actually be more risky than reducing your risk.
So I'll tie into that a couple points. One is automate something that needs to be automated by reaching out to the end state, and the end state being your consumer, right? Whatever that consumer is, because the consumer might be somebody in your IT team that you're helping out, or it might be the consumer that's actually the developer or in line of business or whatever it is that you're working with. That's the end state, right? The true end state. And automate that. Don't automate the stuff that makes your job easier. Make the end state easier. And oh, by the way, along the way, your job will get easier, right? The other one is to really, this is a maturity curve. If you've done automation in the past and it's been very tactical, getting to this end state version of it, it's going to take some effort to change the culture, change all that stuff. Don't go wholesale into it. Go find something that is of high value and automate that and learn from that. Then automate the next thing and learn from that. And along the way, see how much that really becomes a common ground for automating more and more and more until you get to that very broad end state, which is everything is being managed in a more automated way, right? And if you think about it, that's what the public clouds did. Look at how AWS grew up. Their first offering wasn't all of data center. It was just storage. That's all they offered. And then they learned from it. Then they added compute. And then they learned from that. And then they started adding more and more services. And now they have however many thousands of services that they have. And you can look at Google, they did the same thing. Look at Microsoft, they did the same thing. Any IT shop should be looking at it that way. Let's automate something that's as an end state for our consumer, and then let's learn from there.
Yeah, one quick thing, and it obviously potentially it could be another talk in and of itself, but that Juan just touched upon. Also consider how to measure whether you're making progress or not. We can, Juan talked about it. Find what has the most value, automate it, get some value out of that, and then iterate from there. How do you know you're getting value out of it? So if you can find some way to measure, whether it's wall clock time, whether it's man hours, whether it's wait time, while someone's waiting for someone else to do something. Try to find, if you can, some ways to start to measure some of the times and durations and things of that nature, even how inconsistent maybe the deployments are. That might be a tough one to measure, but finding a way to actually bring some metrics back so you can put a value in terms of, metric in terms of type of value you're actually generating and creating.
I think that's perfect. From a consultant perspective, we have talked about the exact capability maturity model, right? So there's the initial, can we do it? Repeatable, can we do it again? Defined, managed, which is collecting those metrics and optimizing. So that's the perfect maturity model. And that isn't start to finish. That's in every step of the way. It's an iterative process, to your point. And I love the fact, Juan, is like, make sure we're not just throwing a dart at a dartboard and say, that's where we want to be. Let's make these things meaningful every step of the way. It needs to be something that gets us to here faster or better or more secure so that we can go to the next phase and be fully willing to change trajectories depending on how things are working out. And it might be that you never were going to end up where you hit the dart on the dartboard. You ended up way over here and it's way better for the organization.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Well, awesome. You guys rock as usual. I'm really excited to always be on a call with you guys. And so we're going to have to do this again. But thanks so much for joining me. And everybody that's looked us up, thanks so much for joining us. If you'd like more information related to the stuff we talk about and other great things, please go to insightcdct.com. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.